of the 50th anniversary celebration of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Our lecture series this year's topic is The Rivers Will Run, a celebration of the WSR, which we've been learning about in detail all semester. Since we're almost done, we only have one more lecture after tonight. I thought it would be a good opportunity to review a little bit about why this has been an in-depth look at the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And so I spent some time today brainstorming how I could best describe this to you, primarily students, but everyone else who's interested in my ramblings. So basically, what I try to do in each of these lecture series is take something and perhaps, for some, depending on whether or not you like the topic, speak to it almost ad nauseum. We do it for weeks and weeks and weeks, the same topic, and we dive a little bit deeper and we look at it through a slightly different lens. And so some of you in your reflection papers have talked about, like, well, I don't know, I can't tell the difference between what this speaker said and what that speaker said, but usually some of you have been starting your reflection with that, and by the end you've actually teased apart, like, oh yeah, here's this new perspective that a speaker brought on this particular topic. And so really, the whole goal of this lecture series, at least since I've been doing it, has been to illustrate to you how we move something from idea to action. Almost every student I have, no matter the age, no matter the life experience, if you're starting out or if you're coming back to school or you're just taking a class, usually throughout a class I'll get the question at least once, but usually multiple times from different people, well, what can I do? How can I make a difference? And so really, that's a complicated answer. There's a lot of different ways that we get from an idea to actually making it an action item in our own lives. Whether we're working on a large-scale campaign, something like a piece of legislation like the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, or a very personal cause that we care about. And so I put this framework up here because the lecture series has hopefully been flowing for you in a way along this spectrum from idea to action. We started with a speaker, Charles Ray, who talked about his personal love for the Salmon River system and this myriad information that he has just from years of being on the river. And yeah, he'd done some activism work, but he had many other lives. Like what really he was speaking to was his deep love of a place, his sense of place, his meaning. And that's where it sparks. That's when we first start something, right? It's because we care about it. And that might be because we heard about it, because we lived it, because our parents lived it. So that's where that starts. So that was the meaning of bringing someone like Charles Ray in. Then from there, and I put Mike Fiebig and Tim Palmer also in that category to an extent because they wove in personal story, why they care about rivers, what they're still doing about rivers. And then we think about the fact-finding phase. Okay, I care about something, now I need to learn about it because I need to be eloquent, I need to understand where my energy is best useful, I need to learn what's not known so I can go out there and help it be known. So that's your fact-finding, your research phase. We heard from Dr. Alan Watson, and to some extent, again, I would bring in Tim Palmer or even Scott Bossy about some of their groundwork in terms of fact-finding and research. And also, in this phase, you're starting to think about broader impacts. Why am I doing this thing I'm doing? How is it going to relate to other causes, to other groups of people, to other world problems and global challenges? Third, you start to think, okay, how do I take what I care about, now that I've got some facts, and engage with a broader audience? This is when we start to maybe initiate some kind of legislative process, or some kind of campaign, or advocacy or outreach. And so, Scott, I think, did a really great job of talking about that legislative process as well as what it means to be in 21st century conservation. Making the sausage, he called it. And a lot of people spoke to that story of him talking about the Headwaters bill in Wyoming. Like, wow, that was kind of crazy to go to somebody's funeral and still be campaigning for this piece of legislation at the same time. Like, no shame. But he shared that story to say, like, this is how it really is on the ground. From there, maybe you move into understanding implications and inviting public process. Now you've got this thing, you care about it, you've built a campaign around it, now pull together as much public input as you can. And last week we heard from managers who have to weed through that feedback and information, and they have to be cognizant of public input and public process along every single aspect of their management decision-making framework. And that's something important that we want to think about going forward is, how do we invite public engagement, transparency in things that we care about and initiate and actions that we follow. And then along this lines, I would throw in education, that you need to continue to put new facts out there so people can continue to understand, learn for themselves, get interested in what you're interested in. And so we heard a little bit from John Gangemi about the River Management Society and how there's education and outreach opportunities that are, just showing up, like the River Leadership Certificate. And then 5, how it relates to the rest of the world, systems of governance, and that's where we're at tonight. So I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, but how does something like the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act act on a global framework? How does it work within systems of governance that are already in play? How can we change those systems of governance? And then 6, and probably again something that flows throughout all of this spectrum, is celebrate awareness and be ready to dig into something for the long haul, because change doesn't happen fast. And we like to think that it does happen fast, and it is true that with a lot of technologies today we can do things pretty quick, but the reality is for big change it's going to take a big amount of time. So the last lecture, the week after spring break, is going to be a kind of a celebration of all of this in film form. So we're going to get to see a sneak peek of the 2018 Wild and Scenic Film Festival selections.
Can I come back for that?
Yeah, of course. Open to the public.
All right.
So that's a lot, but that's kind of where that's a bit of a map in a non-map format. Got some other maps here if people want to look at maps and think about that at the same time. But tonight I'd like to move into introducing tonight's speaker. The title of the talk tonight is The Political Ecology of Wild and Scenic: Lessons for Advancing Resilient River Ecosystems. And we're joined tonight by Dr. Danielle Perry. She's assistant professor at Northern Arizona University in the School of Earth Sciences and Environmental Sustainability. Her work examines the socio-ecological implications of water resource development and conservation policies. Her current projects examine how conservation policies, such as the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, can be applied around the globe for ecosystem service protection and climate adaptation. She brings extensive experience as a river researcher, a guide, and an advocate to her role as faculty advisor for Northern Arizona University's River Research Group and the River Management Society River Studies and Leadership Certificate Program. So she just got the certification going at Northern Arizona University that John had mentioned last week and a few people asked about. For tonight's talk, Dr. Perry is going to expose the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act not only as a standalone policy, but instead more of as a complex part of multiple unprecedented policies reflecting an era of evolving national environmental priorities with a focus on studying, cleaning, restoring, protecting, integrating management, and enhancing water resources for human development, recreation, and biodiversity protection. After threading these policies together, she reveals how the identification of wild and scenic, outstandingly remarkable values, those ORVs that we've been hearing about, how those correlate to the protection of ecosystem services. Situating climate change adaptation and resilience within a river system, framing will reveal how this approach can serve to transform state resource governance practices to straightforwardly facilitate use of river conservation for climate adaptation policy and resilient river ecosystems. She's going to link a lot of what we've been learning about to larger concepts and implications. So with that, let's welcome Dr. Perry to our lecture series. Thank you.
Thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to be in Missoula finally. And springing off of what Natalie was mentioning about purpose and how people get to a place and have a cause, I'll give you a little background about myself. As she mentioned, I was a guide. I was a professional guide for over a decade all across the U.S. West and internationally, particularly in Costa Rica, where I got involved in a river conservation campaign, which you'll hear about at the end of this talk. But that work that I did on the ground as a guide and then advocating for the protection of a river against dam development is what inspired me to go to school. It's what inspired me to go get a master's degree in geography, where I studied the political economy of hydropower development in Latin America. And then I went on to my PhD and did dissertation work about river conservation policy. So what you're going to see today is a lot of my dissertation work, and then the work that I'm now doing thinking about applying wild and scenic river frameworks elsewhere in the world. So as we know, climate change is happening, and as a response, there's this return to infrastructure development as a way to contend with the needs for increased water resources for agriculture and population growth. This new era of big infrastructure, however, stands to really undermine river ecosystems, those ecosystems that are already stressed by demands on those water resources. In particular, rivers are vital for biodiversity and for ecosystem services like bank stabilization and habitat for iconic species, riparian forests for flood mitigation and drought protection. But overall, across the world, only a very small fraction of rivers are protected. And this is a result of that nature as resource versus conservation of nature paradigm, where more energy gets put into developing water resources than protecting them. But because of climate change, river conservation is all the more important because rivers are places where there are so many endemic species, or species that exist in only one place in the world. And with increasing demands and the potential negative impacts on water resources, it puts those endemic species at risk of extinction. So conservation policies are recommended as a way to protect those species and the ecosystem services that our rivers provide. But we know that conservation policy is hard to get implemented. And so that brought me to the literature, where I found this piece by Parenti, which suggested that in order to get conservation policies implemented for climate adaptation, biodiversity protection, et cetera, that we really need to look to the state and look to the legibility acts that the state already conducts on the environment. Those legibility acts, the larger the state governing body, the stronger they are at protecting the resources. Now, legibility, you're asking, what is legibility? Well, according to Scott, legibility is the state's way of knowing and governing its resources through acts like surveying those resources, inventorying them, cataloging them, making policies to govern them, and ultimately managing those resources. So I'm thinking about river conservation policies and legibility and what that equates to, and that's what brought me to the National Wild and Scenic Rivers System. And my research looks at the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act as a legibility act that's set out to identify, catalog, and manage river resources. So against that backdrop, I asked these questions. How has the state employed legibility acts in water resources management through the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act? And the second question is, what does the history of wild and scenic governance suggest about its use for climate adaptation and resilience? Pretty easy, right? To answer these questions, I used a mixed methods approach. The first step was to create a GIS database that I compiled with publicly available data sets and data sets that I created that included pretty much anything I could find about wild and scenic rivers. So the river that was protected, how many miles, what year it was protected, the presidential administration and the division of Congress at time, the resources that were set out for protection and enhancement, those outstandingly remarkable values, and all sorts of other data in this big database. Then I conducted discourse analysis of archival documents that I got from the LBJ Presidential Library Archives in Austin, Texas in the middle of summer. Luckily, there was air conditioning in the archives. There were 134 boxes that I sorted through, and many of those boxes had never been opened since the time that the LBJ administration had ended. So that was really quite an investigation. And then I looked through 17 boxes of documents that I found at the National Archives of Denver office relating to the creation of the act and the eligibility studies that these rivers undergo. I conducted 50 semi-structured interviews with agency personnel from the 4 federal land management agencies that work with wild and scenic rivers, conservation advocates, including the advocates who've been in this room already talking about wild and scenic rivers, and technical experts that work with these rivers. Through triangulation, in that mixed methods approach, I analyzed all of the data to come up with a set of codes. Ultimately, there were 225 codes that came to down to these 6 themes here that emerged from the discourse analysis. So values and ideologies about the environment and about rivers and resources, how location plays into decision-making over designations, stakeholders, those people who have a vested interest in rivers in some way, policy, the different kinds of policies that all influence the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, its creation and its implementation. Capacity, the capacity that this system has to function and do its job, and science, the role of science in Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So the rest of the talk, I will come back to those themes, those 6 themes. So the first question here is, how has the state employed legibility acts in water resources management through the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act? Well, in the archives, I found that at the time that the act was being created, negotiated and created, that this was a time of unprecedented change in the United States. It was a period of rapid population growth and urbanization. People were leaving the rural areas, moving to the cities, and they were looking back at those rural areas not as places where they were going to extract resources to amass wealth, but instead as places where they could go relax their stressed minds from the busy lifestyle of the city and recreate themselves in nature through recreation practices. So there was a booming recreation industry that sprung up around this rate of urbanization and the burgeoning middle class. The recreation industries were making a lot of money off of the technical equipment that's used to go camping and fishing and boating. Today we see that in REI, right? They're advocates for conservation policies. Well, back in this time, the boating industries were also advocating for the protection of their river resources. It was also a geopolitical strategy to conserve our natural resources. This was during the time of the Cold War, when we wanted to seem superior on a global scale. And our superiority was not in just our military might, but it was also in the way that we treated our environment and the way that we looked. So the Beauty for America initiative that Lady Bird Johnson was very much behind led to the development of parks, the cleaning up of the cities, and the increased protection of wild places across the country. Ultimately, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is considered to be a compromise between the national preservation movement and the regional interests centered on dam development. And if you think about the period of dam development in this country, really started in the 1930s, and it went really strong all the way up through the 60s. It took 10 years to negotiate the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. But as Natalie mentioned, what I found was that the Act is not a standalone policy, that it's actually a policy bundled up in a compendium of policies that were all created during this time frame that set out to clean our water, protect our water, understand our water, inventory our water, to govern our water, and catalog our water resources. So the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act comes here in 1968. But you can see this long list of policies that specifically focus on water, among many other policies, including the Wilderness Act of 1964 that was created during this time frame. So one particular act that I consider to be a legibility act is the Water Resources Planning Act of 1965. This policy was using ideas of rational resource use, thinking about water resources in a framework that would later come to be known as integrated water resource management. And this idea that we need to understand water resources on a river basin scale and make decisions about how those water resources are going to be used for different purposes, agriculture, industry, and conservation purposes. So the creation of this policy actually led into the design of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, in which it says that procedures to bring about a flexible but systematic meshing of the scenic river and comprehensive basin planning efforts are needed to provide the best use of the nation's rivers. This idea of integrated water resource management is very much a part of the policy's design. And here, you've probably heard this with your other presenters, but the nuts and bolts of how the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is structured. As I argue, it's a legibility act that sets out for the state to survey, inventory, and catalog its rivers. The 4 federal land management agencies are tasked with doing this. They have to find rivers that are free-flowing, with a high water quality, or at least the potential for that water to be restored to a high quality. And it has to contain at least one outstandingly remarkable value that fits within one of these 8 categories. And you'll notice the other category, and we'll talk a lot about other in a little bit. When a river is finally designated, up to a quarter-mile section is protected in the riparian zone, protecting for some of those ORVs. And at the time, it established the nationwide rivers inventory. Rivers that are protected under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act are subject to Section 7 and NEPA review. So any federally funded development projects that are slated for a river in the system have to undergo these types of review to find out whether it's going to diminish the outstandingly remarkable values or the free-flowing nature of the river. The IWR principles, that notion of being able to plan ahead for how water resources are going to be used, emerges here in this 3-tiered classification system where you can have a river that's either wild, scenic, or recreational. This takes into account the current and future development needs of those rivers. And so rivers that are really far away, out in the wilderness, where you imagine that there's no development that's ever going to take place, are generally classified as wild. But rivers like the Clark Fork that runs through town here, where there are roads and development, would more likely be classified as a recreational river because it has more development around it, and there will be future development as well. There are also different ways to designate rivers that take into account the distinct geographies of this country and where river resources are located. So the Secretary of Interior can designate rivers through Section 2A II, and Congress can designate rivers through Section 5A. And you'll notice here that the majority of rivers are designated through Congress, and very few are designated through the Secretary of Interior, although that is a potential conduit for designation. So these rivers here are designated when a river is already protected at the state level by some sort of state conservation policy. And if the state decides that they would like to see that river included in the national system, then they can approach the secretary and recommend that it get designated that way. And there is a lot of potential there for bringing more rivers into the system in the future. Overall, over the past 50 years, there have been 227 individual designations that are on 208 rivers in this country. But for comparison, that's less than 13,000 miles. And for comparison, there are over 250,000 rivers in this country that flow over 3.5 million miles. So it's a really tiny fraction of rivers that are actually protected. And if we're thinking about expanding conservation policy, I really wanted to understand what is driving that sparse and uneven application of this policy across the country and over time. So that brought me to my second question, which is, what does the history of wild and scenic governance suggest about its use for climate adaptation and resilience? So here you see that over 50 years, their designations were only made in 38 of those years. And this is my favorite year here, in 2009, when you get designations all in this area, and Nevada stands out as a gap, right? Nevada still has no federally recognized wild and scenic rivers. Okay, so what is it that drives this patchwork of designations over time? I asked my database. The literature says that in the 1970s, there was a divergence in party politics over the environment. So I asked my database, is that true? And what my database said was, no, that's not true. It's pretty equal distribution between Republican and Democratic presidential administrations. And I thought, oh, well, yeah, look, it really is kind of even. And then I looked a little closer and I said, well, what are these peak years? We have these peak years under Republican administrations. And if the literature says that there's this party divergence, either the literature is wrong, or my database is wrong, or I need to ask another question, right? So I asked my interview respondents, well, what was going on in these years when we have these high number of designations? And it turns out that those years correspond to anniversary years of the Wild and Scenic Rivers System, or the Act. So this idea of national pride around our conservation policies actually drives a renewed interest in these policies. And we can see that in this year, being the 50th anniversary year, that that's actually true. And there's the 5,000 Miles of Wild initiative to get 5,000 more miles of river designated this year. That correlates to this 2018 anniversary year. So keeping in mind how to get rivers designated, how to advance conservation policy, we think about that sense of national pride and we tap into that, right? So keep that in your bag of tricks for the future. So what I wanted to understand, if presidents weren't really driving this distribution, but we do know that politics drives the designation of rivers, I asked the database how Congress was affecting designations. And what I found out was that 80% of all designations took place at a time when Congress was controlled by Democrats. Okay. That's pretty telling. So if we want to advance conservation policy in this country, then we just need to make sure Congress is blue. Easy, right? No big deal. That'll be an easy thing to accomplish. Not always, right? We know that Congress varies from every couple years. So I asked my interview respondents, what does it take to get a river designated? And some of them said, well, it takes the stars aligning or the heavens aligning or magic. And since I have no control over the cosmos, I asked the database again, what does it take to get a river designated? And it says it takes connection to people. Because what we see here is that even though it generally takes a blue Congress. Many people who affiliate with the Republican Party have championed designations over time. One interview respondent said, if you don't have somebody in Congress that's going to champion it for you, the river, it won't go anywhere. Ultimately, protection is about connection. It's about a person's connection, a politician's connection to their constituents and to their place, to their landscape, right? So in order to advance conservation policy, it really takes developing relationships with people, letting them know why these protections are so important, why they're so vital for society and for the environment. So I wanted to ground this research in place and understand how places, particular aspects of places, affect designations. And here we can see that the United States is divided. It's divided by what's known as the 100th meridian, which is a general view of the division between water policy in this country. In the West, where we have prior appropriation water rights, we have large concentrations of wild and scenic rivers. But in the East, where we have riparian rights, where the land, where the right to the water is correlative to the land that abuts those rivers, we have less wild and scenic rivers. Why is that? Well, I wanted to understand how property rights influenced the designation and distribution of wild and scenic rivers. And I think this map is really telling. In the East, where you have riparian rights, you have a lot of private property. Wild and scenic rivers are scarce there. But in the West, where we have large concentrations of public lands, we have large concentrations of wild and scenic rivers. And that's also the case in the Midwest, in the upper Midwest here, where we have public lands. So places where water is scarce doesn't necessarily drive the designation of rivers. It's the combination of public lands, low population rates, and the presence or absence of water. So thinking about how to grow a system for river conservation really means understanding the distribution of land rights and water rights in this country. And maintaining public lands and public control is really important for the protection of our natural resources. It's a lot harder to get rivers designated in places where there are private lands. And part of the reason is because people don't understand the way that this policy functions. They fear that if there's a federal policy on their land or the river that abuts their land, that it's going to limit their potential to develop or use their lands or waters in the way that they would like. Ultimately, it's a lack of understanding about the policy and the way that it works on the public scale or the federal scale. And to overcome that, we really need education campaigns, such as the campaigns that are going on this year about the policy, to help people understand that it doesn't actually impede their rights to their property. So here we see, overall, there are designations in 40 states and Puerto Rico. There are 10 states that still have no federally designated wild and scenic rivers. But there are wild and scenic rivers in some of these red states. The reason is because at the time that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was created, there was also encouragement from Washington, D.C. for the individual states to come up with their own state scenic systems. And at one time, there were 32 state scenic systems, but today there's only a handful. There's a few that are really strong. California is an example of a system, and Ohio is an example of a state scenic system that actually does protect rivers with the same type of protection that the national policy has. Recently, Oklahoma's state scenic system disappeared. It was swallowed up by a water resources department at the state level. And this substantiates Parenti's claim that it really takes a large governing body to implement and enforce and maintain conservation policies. If you had 32 state scenic systems and now you're down to a handful. But at the same time, if we're thinking about conservation policies and we're thinking about the ways in which politics do influence those policies, and when you have an administration that is either more pro-conservation or pro-development that may threaten the integrity of conservation policies, we may want to turn back to the states at an individual level and recreate those state scenic systems or create state scenic systems where none had existed before, if those states have now decided that protecting their water resources through conservation policy is important. And the system, the framework for those policies already exists. So understanding science now. How does science influence the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act? At the time that the policy was created was at a time when ecology, the science, was emerging as a major study at the university level and at the government level. And you can see here that rivers were actually of really major concern at this time. Okay, this is at a time when rivers were catching on fire, when rivers were heavily polluted. You couldn't eat the fish or the clams that came out, or the mussels that came out of the rivers. I found hundreds of letters in the archives that people had written to President and Lady Bird Johnson asking them to please clean up the rivers, and the response letters that they wrote saying, you know, these letters are coming in from all over the country. We understand your concerns. We're going to do something about protecting your rivers, right? And science, this idea of ecology and how humans affect the environment and how the environment in turn can affect humans, was really integral to the creation of this policy. So I asked my database again. My database and I were good friends by the end of this study. I asked my database, well, how is science playing into the designation of rivers and their resources for protection? And I see here, so here are the 8 categories of ORVs on this side, and the other category in red translates into all of these other ORVs that have been identified for protection and enhancement over time. And the top 2 ORVs that are designated are recreation and scenery. The vast majority of all rivers have those 2 things designated as ORVs. But when you look down, history and culture really don't play all that great of an impact in designations. But ideas like botany and ecology and water quality and traditional use or riparian areas, vegetation, those ideas of ecosystem services, right? The goods and the services that rivers are providing to society for free, those all come into play in the designation of these rivers, even though they're not called ecosystem services in the policy, not yet. So when rivers are considered to be eligible for designation, they have to be free-flowing, that water quality, and 1 ORV. But identifying eligible rivers is complicated by this map. The fact that there are 4 federal land management agencies that all have different regional configurations. One agency has 12 regions, one agency has 7. The boundaries of their jurisdictions don't match, they overlap. And so when you have a national system that you're trying to manage as a holistic system, this can be quite challenging to overcome, especially because identifying those ORVs means identifying ORVs that are regionally and nationally significant. So regionally significant to the BLM may be different to the Forest Service. And even though they do use frameworks like an ecoregion framework to identify ORVs, the frameworks that they use are not consistent. In the BLM in one region, they use an USGS framework, and in another BLM region, they use the Nature Conservancy framework. So even within one agency, the frameworks that they use to identify ORVs is not consistent. And so having a holistic conservation system in this country, I recommend that every agency use one framework, one consistent framework across the country to identify rivers and their resources that are important to society. And I've selected Omernik's EPA Level 3 ecoregion framework because it takes into consideration all of the other factors that each of the other frameworks have without omitting any of the metrics. And it also includes human influence on the environment in this ecoregion framework. So you can see here from this map that the designated rivers, those 208 designated rivers, are really sparsely and unevenly distributed, and that there are many ecoregions. In fact, there are 35 ecoregions that have not one wild and scenic river in them. So if we're thinking about river conservation for biodiversity protection, for the protection of ecosystem services in our rivers, we have a long way to go before we actually have a comprehensive system. We're in luck, though, because we have the nationwide rivers inventory, which consists of over 3,200 rivers that are eligible for designation. So this is a really great starting point to think about how to fill the gaps in protecting rivers in each ecoregion so that we're doing a better job of protecting our river resources. So I have a grad student starting in the fall who's going to work on this project that I've been putting together that will actually analyze the nationwide rivers inventory with utilizing GIS spatial analysis to understand the potential resistance and resilience of the NRI rivers to climate change and to increase societal demands on water resources within that notion, that idea of integrated water resource management, so that we can identify a suite of rivers in each ecoregion that's underrepresented to focus to concentrated conservation efforts on getting a suite of rivers protected in each ecoregion in a proactive manner instead of a reactive manner. Okay, so we do know that getting designations is challenging. And I asked my interview participants, what are the challenges that the system faces as federal employees working in this national system? What types of challenges do you face? And one interview participant said that, I wear many hats. It's difficult for lots of the agencies to keep someone on board that understands the law and the policy. It's an ongoing challenge. So this comes back to that idea of capacity, that there's a lot of turnover in the agencies, there's a lack of institutional knowledge, there might be a lack of a person whose sole job is to work with wild and scenic rivers. This next person says, I don't want to speak for the entire agency because my context is only in the Southwest, but our forests are undertrained and understaffed, particularly when it comes to eligible rivers, but across the board, including designated rivers. So eligible rivers, those rivers on the NRI, they're supposed to be managed as if they were designated to maintain them, to maintain their eligible status. But if if the people working in these agencies are already struggling to manage the designated rivers and all of the other items, all the other tasks that they have, it's hard to focus energy on also protecting those eligible rivers. And in particular, this is challenging because of money. This person says that none of my salary is funded to work on scenic rivers. I don't know if that's an agency thing as much as a congressional thing. So it's according to my sources, they say that we can expect for their budgets to be reduced annually by 5%. And yet populations are growing and development is happening more and more. And so you have shrinking budgets and increased needs for management practices. So one way that we can improve the system and ensure the integrity of our system and to help grow our system is to make sure that we lobby and encourage our congressional representatives and senators to fund our federal agencies so that they can do a good job at protecting our river resources. And this last quote is one that has driven a lot of my thought process on this policy, is that the adjectives wild and scenic, outstandingly remarkable values just don't get politicians on your side. So the day of the tree hugger hippie era is over in this country, right? They had their heyday and people listened when rivers were catching on fire and they were filthy and you couldn't swim in the rivers. But we've done a really good job in this country cleaning up our rivers, right? You saw that whole list of water policies that were implemented. We've done a really good job of cleaning up our air resources and reducing pollution in a lot of places. And so even though there is pollution in our rivers, it's not as stinky as it used to be, right? So these adjectives that were used at this time in this country when we had this beautification policy of beautiful America doesn't work anymore with our politicians and constituents to get them on the side of conservation policy. And so I've thought a lot about, well, how can we make this policy germane to the current day dominant political economic discussion about the environment? And that brought me to this idea of framing ORVs as ecosystem services. Ecosystem services, that term did not exist in the 1960s. It didn't come into use really until the early 80s. Before that, in the 70s, it was called environmental services. But as we mentioned before, our rivers provide a lot of vital ecosystem services to society and to nature. Recreation, a booming tourist economy, the clean water that we drink so we don't have to put a lot of energy and chemicals into treating it and transporting it. Fish habitat for all those fly fishers in the room, right? And habitat for other important species. So how do we take ORVs and frame them as ecosystem services? And how do we argue that ORVs really are ecosystem services? What I found in the archives was this really compelling evidence that was talking about the creation of the Wild and Scenic River System and the protection of the Salmon River next door in Idaho, and the need to increase the protection on that river. It was originally slated to have X number of miles designated, and the Pacific Marine Fisheries Commission said, no, we want more river designated, actually. Let's add additional 60 miles or so to the protected miles here, because this is prime spawning habitat for the salmon, in which our multi-million-dollar industry depends on having that river protected. And so this industry, this interest group, was compelling Congress to move forward with the creation of the river system for the protection of that type of ecosystem service. So that gave me enough justification to go about doing what I set out to do, which was situating ORVs within the four main categories of ecosystem services. So we have provisioning services, regulating services, supporting services, and cultural services. And here are all the ORVs that have been designated over time. And by situating those ORVs within those four main categories, we can demonstrate to society, to politicians, to landowners, to other stakeholders, the benefits, the broad benefits that these ORVs are actually providing to society. Benefits like food security and public health and climate resilience, flood mitigation, drought mitigation, climate refugia, which was used for the very first time here in Montana in an eligibility study, thanks to Scott Bossy, your previous speaker, who talked about the rivers, the headwater streams in Montana being this important climate refugia for migratory fish species. And so we can see that this framework allows, it's flexible, right? It's flexible. Over time, it has incorporated all of this other new environmental knowledge and concerns that we have about our river resources. And it's allowed for them to enter into designations. And through that climate refugia example, we can actually think about this policy in terms of climate adaptation. So thinking about how this system works here in the United States, we look at it in terms of what works, what doesn't work, its potential, the flexibility, what that flexibility provides for the system. We understand now ways in which we can grow the system here in the United States, how we can improve it, and then thinking about the global community and the global river resources that need to be protected. So around the world, that IWRM framework, that integrated water resource management framework, is touted as a framework in which developing countries should adopt for the planning and management of their water resources, including the ecological concerns of their countries. And I've shown you how our own policy, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, incorporated that IWRM, the notion of IWRM in the creation of the policy. It's a policy framework that's ready to be exported abroad or adopted by countries that are interested in this type of conservation. And so I'm currently working in 2 countries thinking about this type of policy creation and adoption. And one is China. We all know, we hear about China and the rapid development and the mega dams and the destruction of the environment in China. But China is actually on a very similar development trajectory that we were on at the time that our Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was being created. The same bell curve that we went on, where you have rapid development and then a lot of environmental degradation and the implementation of conservation policies and the restoration and kind of the decline in major development of water resources, that kind of bell curve that we went through, that's exactly what's happening in China today. And so as China sets out on this plan for having an ecological civilization that can strike a balance or a harmony between their development and conservation needs, they are looking to implement a Wild and Scenic Rivers policy. Dr. Alan Watson here in the room is also working on this problem in China. And so this river here, the Qingzhou River, or what's known as the Bamboo River, is home to the world's largest amphibian, the giant Chinese salamander, which can grow to be the size of an average man, 6 foot tall, big salamander. But it's one of the most endangered species in the world, actually. It's called an edge species. It's evolutionarily distinct because it's a living dinosaur. And it's in a great threat of extinction. So this river is one of the habitats of the salamander, and it's one of the reasons why this river has been slated as a study river for the creation of a Wild and Scenic River policy in China. This river is beautiful. It includes all sorts of other ecosystem services, and this is just one of those services. In Costa Rica, where I started out as an advocate, I mentioned to you, there's a lack of policy. So I started on a conservation campaign there in 2001 to save the Rio Pacuare from being dammed. We won multiple battles over the last years. In 2005, there was a plebiscite where the people in the community that I lived in voted against having any dam development on this river. And the following year, a new president came to power, and he basically reversed that decision and said, no, we're going to move forward with building dams on this river because I'm a pro-development candidate. And so the campaign continued to come up with some sort of permanent protection of the river. There was an idea that this river would be made a national park, but it's also home to the Quebecer Indians. And we know that it's really problematic to put borders around places that people have traditionally used for their livelihoods and their lifestyles. And so national parks are polygons on a map. Pretty easy to put a polygon on a map and say, I'm going to protect everything that's in this. But when you have a flow resource or a fugitive resource like water, it's a lot harder to govern because there's a lot of interests that are involved in that moving resource, right? And then you couple that with Native American people or indigenous people in this case, it becomes more problematic, and you can't put a national park in their reserve lands. And so the challenge in Costa Rica, in this place that depends on ecotourism as one of its largest industries, or arguably its largest industry, is having a policy or the lack of policy to protect its river resources that are really important for the tourism industry and the integrity of these cultures that depend on these river resources. So here I'm working with a group of people to think about ways in which they can adopt the Wild and Scenic Rivers Policy Framework to create a policy in Costa Rica that would work to protect the pecuary and other vital river resources. So in conclusion, what I found through this research is that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is really a legibility act that was set out to protect and enhance the river resources that we have deemed important in this country over time. And that has changed as our environmental priorities have changed. The distribution, however, of this policy and the capacity of the policy are corollaries of evolving national environmental ideologies and knowledge. So our ideologies about the environment, whether we believe that the environment is some place that we should be extracting resources for economic development purposes and financial gain, or whether the environment should be left intact and integral because it provides these ecosystem services and habitat for biodiversity. Those types of ideologies really drive the distribution of this policy. To deal with that distribution, if we reframe ORVs as ecosystem services, we can really demonstrate to society the broad benefits that river conservation provides to us as a nation and to the world. And that the flexible design of the policy does indeed provide an adaptation policy framework for addressing new environmental concerns and challenges in utilizing this integrated water resources management framework. Okay. Thank you very much. Questions? Yes.
So how easy is it for Congress or the Secretary to unclassify a river, and the designation, how strong is it? Is it strong enough to stop the pipeline? Is that possible?
That's a great question. So for those of you in the back that couldn't hear, the question was, how easy is it for a designation to be undone? And how strong is the policy to protect against something like a pipeline? So what I found in my research is that this policy has teeth. Before the special issue of the International Journal of Wilderness came out in December, there was very scant research published on this policy. But what did exist was law review articles, journal articles about cases in which this policy had been put to the test. And time and time and time again, in all of those cases, the policy stands up to pressures to unravel the protections, which is fantastic. It really is a well thought out, well-crafted policy that takes into consideration all of these different types of pressures. And because to get a river designated, it really goes through a very rigorous suitability study that takes into account the multiple stakeholders' demands on those water resources. And so once a river is designated, it's pretty clear that it's going to stay designated because everyone's agreed to designate that particular portion of river. And sometimes it's down to the negotiation that happens over a designation can be about feet. Right? So you start out with a proposed 200-mile designation, and it might end up as 196 because those last 4 miles, someone has their sights on developing something there or utilizing the resources in another way. So what is protected generally stays protected. And recently we've seen threats to the designation. There's been, in California in particular, on the Merced Wild and Scenic River, there have been multiple bills that have proposed to Congress over the last 8 years at this point in time to try to de-designate a section of the river so that a dam height can be increased to reclaim or to hold more water in a reservoir. And so far, all of those bills have passed, which is a good thing, because if it happens in one place, then it really undermines the integrity of the whole act. And so far, those bills have all failed, but the representatives in California continue to propose those bills. So we do have to remain vigilant to make sure that they don't pass. In terms of stopping a pipeline, that becomes a little more complicated because, as I mentioned, a river that is designated, if any federal funding goes to support the development of some sort of pipeline, for example, it has to undergo an environmental impact assessment and NEPA analysis, which is Section 7 of the policy, to understand if that development will undermine in any way the free-flowing nature of the river or the integrity of the ORVs. So there have been cases where, in Idaho, for example, there was a lawsuit that was brought against a company that was transporting these megaloads up the highway along the Lochsa. You may have heard about that case. And by transporting these huge excavating loads of equipment on the highway, it was undermining the scenic values of the river. And so that lawsuit actually ended the transport of those megaloads along the highway. In terms of a pipeline, if the pipeline were to undermine the scenic ORV or the recreation ORV, or if it were to pollute the water in some way or pose a potential threat to, say, fish habitat or some other important ORV, then it could actually stop that development. Or it could impose some sort of restructuring of the project. Oftentimes projects aren't completely halted, but they have to be redesigned in such a way that they wouldn't negatively impact the ORVs.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've also seen in some of my own research on wild scenic rivers and just causes like this, the role of a champion who spent time there, and it makes it hard to take conclusions or lessons learned for how one place became more protected and transplant them to other places, knowing that that champion is such a key actor in that transition.
Right.
Do you think that this shift in the framework or the ideas behind or the values of an ORV could help kind of pivot to, I mean, you can't just always have a champion.
Right. Yeah, I understand. That's a good question. Well, you could take your champion on the road with you, I suppose, from river to river. But the goal of reframing ORVs as ecosystem services is to be able to say, hey, look, this river provides all of these important services to our local communities. And I actually have a grant from the National Park Service that I'm working on right now, getting underway, which is the goal is to take that conceptual framework of ecosystem services and go into the field and actually identify the ecosystem services as some of the national parks rivers. And so I'll be back in the summer. I'm actually going to be working on the Flathead as one of my case study rivers. So we'll use that initial study of a couple case studies to frame those ORVs as ecosystem services with real case studies and examples, and then that can be translated to other wild and scenic rivers, not just through the national parks part of the system, but through all the different agencies. Yep. Any other questions? Oh.
Since Congress does most of the designating, and you showed a map of ecoregions,
Yes.
the 3,200 potential rivers, I assume that you must have overlaid the congressional districts on top of that, if any idea, so you would know how many representatives had a potential river in their district, because if they don't, they probably don't care.
That's a good point. And when we do this analysis in the fall, we actually will be taking that into consideration. Yes, so we're going to take in, this study is going to include many different data sets, many of the ones that I used in this initial database analysis, but then also looking at land use for each river, stream disturbance, stream type, biodiversity presence, aquatic ecosystems, the political jurisdictions around those rivers, climate projections, slope and aspect of the river basin, pretty much any kind of data set that we can get our hands on that will really help us to identify those rivers that have that potential for resilience to social pressures as well as ecological pressures or environmental pressures, climate pressures, that have the most potential for designation. And the idea there is to get a handful, at least a handful of rivers in each ecoregion designated. But part of that really comes down to the political will. Absolutely. And what I found in my research is that most rivers are designated as a reactive solution to a threat. But the easiest rivers to get designated are the ones that are designated in a proactive fashion. So this study, the goal of this study is to identify rivers that aren't necessarily threatened, that we can readily get out and proactively rally around to get designated before they really face a lot of threats.
The policy one, and overlaying that, the chart that you showed of the years that they were designated, it may have been anniversaries, but it kind of looked like those were presidential election years.
This one?
Yes, it looked like the last year in an administration, when the administration was
Oh
going
yeah,
to
so
change.
the 2009, this one?
No, the other ones, because 2009 wasn't an election.
It wasn't, but these designations were actually supposed to happen in 2008 under the Bush administration during the anniversary. And it just took a little bit longer, so it happened under Obama. But it really belongs to the Bush administration.
And they do look like the last year of an administration where the administration is going to change, a presidential.
It does look like that, yeah. So 88 was the 20-year anniversary, and 92 was right around the 25-year anniversary, and then this was the 40 anniversary. One interesting thing about the Reagan administration because this was, we know this was a time of Reaganomics and neoliberalization, and Reagan really wasn't pro-environmental protection. But what happened was he cut back so much on federal spending on any types of projects that it allowed the advocates to get a foot in the door and do a lot of advocating for river designations during that time. So that cut on federal expenditures for infrastructure worked in favor of the environment during that time. Yeah. So this is an interesting one that you might like then, since you took an interest in that last graphic. Here we see that the majority of all designations take place in the second session of Congress. The bills get introduced in the first session, they get revised and edited, and things get added and subtracted, and the negotiations happen, and it takes a long time. It takes a really long time to get rivers designated. And so usually that's happening at the end of a session. And maybe that correlates to those election years. Yeah, when there's an election about to happen. Yes.
Going back to reactive versus proactive designation, definitely understand the approach that proactive is easier to designate because there might not be an opposing force. But you have another speaker sort of speak to the opposite of that, in the sense that if there's a reactive designation, oftentimes people will just have more of a fire under them to get it designated. So what do you see as the relationship?
That's absolutely true, that people are complacent. And when they don't perceive a threat to their beloved river resource, they have no reason to act otherwise. But when that dam or that mine or that highway or that logging project or whatever it is proposed, then they get upset and they rally their troops, right? And they have a fire that fuels that campaign to protect the river. But what I argue is that climate change is a huge threat to our river resources. It might be an invisible threat, but it's a real threat. And so rallying to proactively protect rivers is still a reaction to climate change and a reaction to those increasing demands on our water resources. So if we frame this as climate adaptation policy, that need to protect rivers because we are facing this threat, that the biodiversity in the rivers is really at risk for those extinctions of endemic species, then you can still rally together people behind a campaign that doesn't necessarily have a really visible impact, like a dam. Yep. Yes.
I think another interesting question you might, even your grad student might ask, is you're looking at the pulses of designation, or how many of those bills were passed as standalone bills, and which ones were bundled up and slipped into an omnibus package? Well,
so this was definitely an omnibus bill. And that's a good question. Generally, when you have multiple designations like that, there have been quite a lot of individual bills proposed over time, and they have to work out the details of the designation, and so they will wrap them all up into one big bill like you see here. But it's because there's been this concerted effort for multiple years to get, say, 5,000 miles of river designated like we're seeing right now. And each one of those can take an individual bill or the negotiation with local politicians before it gets into this big policy designation. Yeah.
A couple of comments. One, I got interested, I think, in this through Tim Palmer's presentation in early in the semester, where he talked about the vote on the original Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And I kind of asked him, what about the 7 in the House that voted against it? And he didn't really have any information. He knew one person. So I got curious and went back and looked at that. 2 things. One, the vote he gave us was 7 against, and it was only like 220 or something for it. I thought, well, that doesn't look right. Has our house changed that much? I went back and looked at that vote, and it was like 4 Republicans, 3 Democrats. They were Virginia, Illinois. There was nothing about those 7 that spoke to me. But what did speak to me was 162 that voted present. That's really interesting, and I'm not educated enough in political votes to understand the implication of that. But that seemed like I want to say lethargic. What's the word I want to use? It's like, well, maybe your question about is it in your congressional district or not? So over a third of the House said, "We'll do whatever you want. We don't care.
Yeah.
We just voted present." And I guess that means the people who really care. So looking at those votes, and they had it broke down. I had to go back to the congressional record to find that one rainy day in my office. I don't know why I was doing that, but I was so curious to see who voted against it, because it was unanimous in the Senate. We were told unanimous. I assume that I should have looked to see whether that was actually 100 positive votes or whether that was 40 in favor and 60 present or something. But that vote is really interesting, and I'd encourage you to pay attention to those votes when they come up to that. What's it really telling us about our Congress? Right now here in Montana, that East Rosebud has gone through the Senate last year, I think, and it went through the House this year. So we've got
on its way.
2 Republicans in the House and a Democrat in the Senate that are all supporting that East Rosebud. So, that was a mining or a hydropower permit that was issued in 2009, but it expired in 2013. So when there is a threat like that, particularly a place where Congressman Jim Forte says he takes his family hiking a lot, I guess they're adamant that our Montana delegation is adamant about that, being the first one since '76, I think, for Montana. And there's a lot of them proposed for Montana. It'd be interesting to see what happens.
Right.
But if I can, just one other comment. We talked in a class today, we talked a lot about, if it was today, would we use outstanding and remarkable values, or would we use ecosystem services? And we do a lot of ecosystem services research, and we don't use that term with the public very much, actually. It's even hard to develop a brochure to talk to congressional staff so they understood what we're talking about with water-based ecosystem services. You can talk about relationships between people in the national forest or rivers, and those relationships are those meaningful, values. But let me tell you that, and I touched on it a little bit today, I think, that around the world, and I presented this class a few weeks ago, kind of an international assessment, continent by continent, of catchment areas. And I'm sitting here thinking now about intactness. There's a lot of international discussion about intactness and integrity. And we're coming up with ways to conclude that, which would mean no diversions, no dams, no development.
Yeah.
So that certainly addresses just the wild part, not the scenic or recreation. But for that wild part, it seems a highly valued, part of the landscape right now. It seems like we're having meetings and conferences. We're sending people from China over to the U.S. National Geographic is hosting a meeting on intactness. And we're trying to figure out ways to look at Chinese catchment areas. What do you think about that? I mean, doesn't that intactness, at least for the wild ones, suggest all those ecosystem services are a substantial, not all of them, but again, in the wild end of the spectrum, a large number of them. And maybe there's outstanding and remarkable values of 1960s, maybe there's ecosystem services, 80s, 90s, 2000s. Maybe there's something else that, if you thought of other things, we're using intactness or integrity.
Yeah, I think those are really important aspects to bring into this discussion of ecological integrity, ecosystem integrity, and the intactness of the river. And I think that there's a couple aspects of this policy, the way it's designed, that really could be improved. And so if it is going to be implemented abroad, I would recommend expanding the area of riparian protection beyond that 1/4 of a mile to really take into consideration that the species that are using the riparian corridor obviously move more than 1/4 of a mile, that water resources that are tributaries to these streams are coming from more than 1/4 of a mile away. And so thinking about the river basin as a whole and not just the linear feature of the river, which is really what was being taken into consideration when the policy was first created, was thinking about the river as just this linear feature and what was on the immediate environments around it. But intactness and integrity are really important because, as we know, those resources don't stop at the riparian area. They are influenced and they influence other important resources outside. So I think that's really important, and I'm looking forward to that piece that's coming out that's looking at basin integrity because it will, I think it's an advancement in society and understanding about the environment that really needs to be taken into consideration when thinking about river conservation. And here, like I said, there's 227 individual designations on 208 rivers, and some of those designations can only be 7 miles. But when you're, like we talked about, if you're protecting a 7-mile stretch of river that has a flow resource running through it, that resource is being influenced by upstream and downstream activities. So if you have a river like the Middle Fork Salmon or the Selway, which really is wild and way out there and not a lot of pressures on the surrounding environments, then you can think of them as being intact. But that's not the case for all the rivers, and we want to see more rivers get protected. Rivers that are run through private property areas, right? So we have to think about, what's happening upstream, what's happening downstream, what's happening on both sides of the banks beyond that 1/4 mile section. So if we can see whole river systems get protected, that would be excellent. That there's kind of a lack of whole river systems in a lot of places in the world. So at least bringing into consideration the tributaries and the headwaters and not just focusing on the most scenic gorges, but that integral idea of a river basin, I think, is really important and a way to improve upon the system. Yes.
So the Wilderness Act was passed just 4 years before, 1964, and it does, to some extent, protect entire ecosystems. That's not really what it was designed for, though. And we're seeing from the Montana delegate a fair amount of pushback for our new wilderness designations, or at least to move the ledger from wilderness study area over to fully protected wilderness. Is that because of the terrestrial implications, or what observations have you seen with respect to trends or parallels between wilderness designations and Wild and Scenic River Act designations?
It's a good question. That is not my area of expertise. Yeah.
It'd be a really interesting area of overlap or divergence to tease out.
I really think that people's willingness to designate, it's a pendulum, just like political administrations, and depends on the interests at the time. It depends on the way the economy is working. And when people are flush and everyone has got a job and they have time to go recreate, they're a little more inclined to designate. But when people are struggling to work and feed their families and they think of the environment as this potential source of wealth, then they're less inclined to put boundaries around it.
Interesting when you look at how many were designated in 2009 after the crash of 2008.
Yeah.
So maybe people spiritually needed something, some kind of balm to the economic crisis.
Yeah, well, like I mentioned, that was an anniversary period, and that had been many years of advocating for those rivers to get protected. And I don't know if the full implications of the crash were really known at that time, but it was already in the works in 2008. It was really like just a matter of words on paper to get it pushed through, and so it took a little bit longer. Yeah. Yes.
You used the Selway as like a really good example as like being a very pristine, very like the definition of what a wild designation would be for a wild scenic river. Do you think having more rivers that are designated that don't exactly fit into what has already been designated now, would that put less of an emphasis and less like a critical management like would that kind of degrade in the long run those very, very like pristine rivers when you compare them to something that has the same title of wild and scenic, maybe not the same level of designation, but the broad same wild and scenic under the same act? Do you think in the long run that would have some sort of impact on just not keeping those very wild rivers to the same degree as ones that may not be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that comes down to capacity. And so one of the challenges with this system, as the interview respondent said, is that there's a lack of funding coming down from Congress. And so designating more rivers is a concern because the land management agencies are already strapped, right? They're financially, their budgets are constrained. And so there is a lot of concern about designating more rivers because it's going to take more resources to manage them as such. On the flip side of that, though, is that eligible rivers are supposed to be managed as if they're designated. And so if an agency is doing a really good job of complying with the law, they're putting a lot of effort into managing those 3,200 rivers, right? And keeping them eligible.
Budget
So,
aside, then what's the difference between the listed rivers and the actual designated rivers?
because if it's eligible, development can still happen and they can still be degraded. It doesn't mean that they are protected, it's just they're managed as if they were to some degree if the agencies are doing their job the right way. But if someone wants to build a water development project on that river, they can attempt to do it. And as long as it doesn't fully undermine the eligibility status, then they may be able to move forward with it. Going from eligible to suitable to an actual designation is a big leap, right? And more rivers are being found eligible as agencies are redoing their resource management plans. They have to do that every 20 years or so. And so as they redo their resource management plans, their mandate is to go out and identify rivers that are eligible. And what they used to just look at that like main river corridor, those really scenic, beautiful, river sections that are whole. But now we understand that tributaries are important and headwater streams are important and ephemeral streams are important, especially in like the arid Southwest where I live. So more and more of these rivers are being found eligible, which puts an actual burden on the agencies to manage them properly, even though it's a good thing that they do that. So my idea with the study is to go back and look at all those eligible rivers and see, are they still really eligible? How much have they been developed since 1992 when that list was updated? And of all of those eligible rivers, where should we really be focusing our efforts to get them designated so we can focus our limited resources in those particular places? And maybe some of those other rivers are better suited for water development projects because we do need more water. I used to be completely anti-dam, but I'm a realist at this point in my life, and I understand that we need water resources. And while I wish that we would protect and reduce our demand on water resources, which we have a lot of potential to do that in this country, we still have to develop water resources to some degree to meet the population demands. So maybe some of those rivers that are eligible might be better suited for that new dam or that water diversion project or for irrigation. I think when we look at our river resources and we really understand all the benefits that they're providing to society, through that ecosystem services framework, however you want to use that to demonstrate the benefits, hopefully we can get a little bit more money put in those budgets to better manage all those rivers, even the eligible ones. But I don't think that designating more rivers is going to mean that the Selway or the Middle Fork or the Flathead get less money. They're very vital, very important rivers. I just think that the lack of money is what hinders getting more rivers protected. I think we're out of time, yeah.
To cut you off.
Okay,
Well,
that's
I have to
okay.
cut off the questions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thanks for all the
thank you
great
so much.
questions.